All right, we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. This is the April 7th, 2020 Club Cubase Google Hangout. So we'll let people get logged in. My name is Greg Ondo. I work for Yamaha Corporation of America, based in the United States in Alexandria, Virginia. And I'll be the host for the Q&A today. If you haven't been on one before, we have just people fire off questions and learn all sorts of tips and tricks. We are doing this live. If you are watching it afterwards, we're going to try to have an index of topics that are covered generally within about maybe tomorrow morning. Hopefully we'll have the index up. So if you're watching it live, you could refer to that. Otherwise, we could have live interactive Q&As. So we'll just have people get logged in. If you're watching this live, feel free to introduce yourself. If you're not watching it live, you may want to go ahead and skip to about maybe 8 or 10 minutes as people get logged in. So we're going to have people getting logged in as we do this. Okay, so we'll just give that a couple minutes and see some familiar faces. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead, and more people are getting logged in. Okay, so I see sección edición de acordes. So is that maybe on chords? I'm sorry, my Spanish kind of isn't so good. All right, so I see a question from Al Williams. Good to see you on a hangout. Okay, so we see some questions that were sent in. We had some people in the future. If you want to submit questions in advance, you could send it to clubcubase@steinberg.de. It kind of gets forwarded to my email address, so I don't see the actual email address. So if you put your email address in there, I could respond directly to you. So once again, that's clubcubase@steinberg.de. Okay, so we'll go through, we'll let some people get logged in. All right, so we have some more people logging in. Okay, we hope that everyone is feeling healthy and safe. We know a lot of people are staying home, so that's why we kind of have significantly upped our Google Hangouts to help people get the most out of their Cubase. Okay, so we see different people. So I think Millard, he's been on a few of the Hangouts recently. So he's from Pennsylvania, if memory serves. All right, so we have Norway. We have Robbie from Dallas, Sweden. Okay. Okay, so we see a question about some of the stuff that's in Nuendo that's not necessarily in Cubase. So we'll see, we go through some of those. Okay, so it's a question on audio grouping from Greece. All right, so we have Glasgow. Okay, lots of people getting logged in. Okay, so we have West Virginia, not too far from me, Sweden, Finland. Okay, so and probably like many of you, my son is in first grade and he's going to be at home during the hangout, so he may lose patience and knock on the door. So I'll apologize in advance for any disruptions, but I'm sure many people with kids are going through the same exact things. Okay, so seeing question automation. All right, we have Georgia. Okay. Okay, so all right, so seeing questions on Time Warp. We have Cambridge, UK. All right, aligning. We have Toronto, Switzerland, Bern. Always wanted to go to Switzerland. Okay, so more people getting logged in. Okay, so again, we'll just getting people logged in. If you have questions, go ahead, ask it in the comments field, and we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. All right, so we have Merrillville, Indiana. I believe that's just right across the Illinois border. I think I've been there a couple times driving through and stopping at the Guitar Center, I think is there. Okay, so we have people who are still working as essential workers in UK, Ambient Dave, so thank you for doing that. All right, so we have Kentucky, Florida, Concord, New Hampshire, Germany. Okay. Okay, how much, I see just a quick question, how much disk space does a typical installation of Pro require? If you do it with all the content, I think it's about 21 gigs or so. All right, so we have Utah, Switzerland. Okay, how can I get Cubase 10? Okay, we'll just go through some of those. All right, so we have France, Sacramento. Okay. Okay, so wait just another minute or two, and we'll get started. We have more people logging in. Okay. All right, so we have Austria, France, Israel, Texas. Okay, so more people are getting logged in. We'll just wait until it kind of plateaus a little bit, and then we will start going. Okay, we have Russia. We have Ottawa in Canada. Okay, Hawaii. All right, so we have Houston. I see the question. How do I manage a 7-year-old birthday while in quarantine? We had a Zoom birthday party, so it was the new normal. So he did very well with it. So we're happy that his classmates and our family from around the country got to get on. All right, so we have people logging in from Germany. We had a little bunch of people starting to log in again. All right, so. All right, we'll give it just about another 30 seconds and get going. Okay, so I just see a question. Hey, Greg, where are you from? So I live in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. All right, so you see California, it's another one from Switzerland. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So we'll just kind of scroll. I know I may not be able to get to everyone's questions, but we'll try to answer as many questions as succinctly and completely as possible. So we'll give it a shot. All right, so let's get going. Okay. Could you go over, this from Al Williams, good to see you on a Hangout, Al. Could you go over DSP Mix FX for URC and how it can be set up? The one thing that's a little strange, and we're kind of working with some of our colleagues to get this sorted out. But if we come over here, let's do a new project. And this works a little differently. So, the URCs can have their own built-in DSP. So if we go to our audio connections, I will just set for my inputs, and I'm using a UR24C, and let's set my outputs to here. So, and I'm going to add an audio track. And let's see if I had the drivers set up correctly. So I'll say let's just add a mono track going to a stereo out. And now at this point, you could probably, I don't think I have the extension, but you would see kind of the DSP capability. And one thing that's a little odd is that you have to have the outputs connected here. And then what you do is, I don't think I have the correct extension installed, but you'll see the hardware tab in the inspector. And this is where you'd be able to access all of the internal DSP, but it may not show up. And it seems kind of counterintuitive if you've been a Cubase user for a while to have to set the outputs accordingly here. So if you just have this routed to the control room speakers, you may not see the onboard DSP, but I don't have the extension installed. And here's my son looking. Let me just mute very quickly, and I'll be right back. All right, so we'll move on. Thanks for accommodating me. I may have to go turn on another movie. Hang on, just excuse me 1 second. All right, I'm sorry about that. All right, I think he should be watching a movie for a little bit. Okay. So it says, question, my audio interface is a UR242. How can I use its internal processor in Cubase? So many of the interfaces, depending on their outputs, if we go to the audio connections, you may be able to, let me see if this will work. Excuse me 1 second. All right. So again, I apologize for the interruption. But sometimes you could add an internal bus. I think with the 242, you may be able, when you go here, you could see two buses that will be set up for the DSP Mix FX, and you could have the audio kind of go directly into the interface and be powered by the DSP in the interface itself. It's hard to render that file out, but you also have the built-in plugins as native versions. All right, so let's go on. I apologize for the interruptions. Okay, so we had a question about, could you please talk about the Hallion library creator? So what the Hallion library creator is going to allow you to do is if we have your VST instrument, and let's say if we have Hallion, so we'll go ahead and just kind of load it up. So the library creator is going to allow you to kind of take different aspects. So you could say, I wanted to, have, different types. It's going to basically allow you to build your own instruments. So you could come over here, give it, different graphic images. You could build synthesis, samples. So within here, and I could see if I could maybe for the next Hangout, have a more detailed, maybe like a walkthrough description of this, but that's kind of what the library creator allows you to do, is to kind of build your own instrument. So we've had several composers and kind of highly regarded users like Danny Lux, well-known composer, has built his own set of instruments using Hallion. Chris St. Aubin, who many people may know from like the Cubase users Facebook page, he just came out with Simple, his own synthesizer as well. And so basically it allows you to build instruments using a combination of synthesis and samples and using your own graphic images. So that's what the library creator allows you to do. Okay. Okay, so would like to know how to mix properly the vet instructions, and I'm not sure if this is with the library creator. Okay, so we'll kind of move on. So we'll scroll down. I apologize for the interruptions. Hopefully we'll be okay for another hour and a half or hour and 40 minutes. Okay. Okay, it says, I have a question about an option in the VST audio system. What's the difference between 32 and 64-bit floating point processing precision? And we could see this directly in, if we go to the studio setup and go to the VST audio system, you'll have this option for processing system. So what this will allow you to do is, before Cubase, before version 10, it would allow you to record, the highest bit depth was 24-bit. So if we added more information, such as different effects processing, EQs, and automation, if we did everything at fixed point at 24-bit resolution for the processing, that would allow you that would limit the capabilities and what is added into the signal to the original audio file. So that's why previously we'd been doing everything in 32-bit floating point. So you could have a 24-bit word length audio file and be able to add different effects without taking away the quality of the original 24-bit audio. With version 10, we introduced 32-bit integer recording. So with that, to capture the full 32-bit and go to add different effects processing, they've doubled the effects precision, and that's what we see here. So I did kind of an interesting test. I have one of my friends, a guy named Greg Lukens, who's very highly regarded in mastering circles and pro audio circles. He's based in Washington, D.C. area. And he's a blind mastering engineer, and he probably has the best ears of anyone I've ever met in my life. And just to see if it made sense once, when this option came out, when we were doing testing, I sent him a file that was the same project that was mixed, and I exported it as with the 32-bit floating point resolution and the same settings and everything, and I switched it to 64-bit floating point. For the processing precision, I mailed him both files, and I said, which one is better and why. So he played both of them. He's like, this file is definitely a little smoother. It's a little better. He's like, it's very subtle, but this one's better, and I'm not sure why. And that was the 64-bit. So in my estimation, that's kind of my personal blind user test. So it kind of, he could tell the difference every single time with that. So it could be subtle, if you're doing, maybe like a thrash metal thing, it may not come across, but if you're doing like a lot of classical stuff and let's say like very like acoustic instruments, it could be pretty apparent. So it'll give you kind of a higher resolution, especially if you're working with files that were recorded at 32-bit integer. So like our URC interfaces as well as the AXR. Okay, so we'll move on. Groove agent styles let me use a negative swing. Is there any way to quantize with negative swing in Cubase? I guess the negative swing pattern, make a negative swing pattern in Groove Agent and use it as a quantize preset. So yeah, you could definitely do that. And if you're not familiar with that, if we have in a instrument here, let's say I'll just load up a Groove Agent. I'll just drag it over. Okay, and I'll just find a quick preset. And we'll load this up. If you don't know how to actually have, patterns or making your own swing feels, let's say if I just wanted to kind of play this and let me adjust the tempo down a little more reasonably. Okay, so I could just drag a particular file and we could adjust kind of the swing here. So as we play it back, for that particular pattern, I could drag that pattern over into my project window. And if we open up our quantize presets, we could now just kind of come over here. We'll see our quantize presets just to the right of the quantize value. And I could just take this particular pattern and drag it in. And now I could save that as my own quantize preset. So at that point, you could just use that on any other track for MIDI or audio parts. So that way you could have your own kind of library of quantized presets. Okay. Good to see Robbie Bowling on from Dallas. Okay, so let's go through some more questions. Okay, so we had a question. How about those Nuendo features not present in Cubase? I'm talking about the big... I'm not talking about the big and obvious ones, but the other small stuff that no one mentioned. So we'll go ahead and boot up Nuendo quickly here. Okay, give me just a second. My mouse is getting a little weird. All right. Okay, so some of the things that are in Nuendo that may not be as obvious. So, Nuendo will be able to do wider surround sound. So it's going to be doing Dolby Atmos. We could have, let me just load up a particular project here very quickly. Okay, so when you probably first start off, things may look pretty similar to Cubase, but some of the things that will be a bit different when we go to add channel width. So we go to add an audio channel. We can come here and we'll say, okay, instead of just the channel configuration being mono stereo, I could have it be like a Dolby Atmos output. So if we have this set for a Dolby Atmos output in our mixer, we could just simply have access to wider different surround formats. So, and if you wanted to, let me just add an Atmos output in my audio connection so that we could see that quickly. And I'll just route this to my Atmos output. So when we go to, let's say, our panner, and you could also just have kind of the VST multi-panner. So I'll just, so now you could have, different panning positions for height as well. Some other things that may not be as obvious, it's going to have full ADR functionality. So you could do dialogue replacement and have kind of streamers. So you could have kind of the video swipes. It's going to have some additional plugins. So if you wanted to, for doing sound design work, so if we wanted to, it's probably going to be under other, but like a randomizer. So if you have an audio file selected and you want it to just, randomize different components. So I'll just kind of select an audio file here and we'll just run. And this is kind of more designed as an offline process. So you could just come right over here, and if you have like the same footstep, you could just do that, like, and have select 100 of the same files and have different levels of pitch, intensity, and color and timing. So it's really handy for doing sound design work. There's going to be some really handy like naming functions as well. So if you tend to work with a zillion audio file, you could go to different naming conventions so that you could rename files based on from like a spreadsheet. There will be some other things like video cut detection. So if we import a video file, it could automatically place markers. We'll have field audio recorders. So if you have like a sound devices recorder, at that point you could just simply take all the metadata from sound devices and be able to have that. So if you had let's say you had 8 microphones on a source and you wanted to switch to where the actor had turned their head, you could do that and have those different sound and replace the different sound sources and be able to extract metadata from that. So so there's just, and some additional plugins, like there's going to be a post filter. So if you wanted to do a bit more kind of restoration stuff, or maybe you wanted to just grab and I think we'll see this under EQ. So as we would just adjust our frequency range here, you could do that, and then you could just kind of add the harmonic overtone series. So if you wanted to find an annoying frequency here, and then you could just at that point you could just be able to EQ and notch out the annoying frequencies plus the overtone series. So some additional plugins, when there's some also additional automation modes where you could, capture different passes. So if you need to go from one scene to another scene and be able to write and do touch collect on automation. So those are a couple of the things that are, and I'm probably missing some really obvious ones, will allow you to kind of work that kind of distinguish Nuendo a bit. And, one of the big ones obviously is going to be like Game Audio Connect. So if you're working with Wise middleware, you could export or drag and drop files directly in here and be able to access your metadata to your game audio engine. There's reconforming, so that you could, if someone had done picture edits, you could import the edit decision list and be able to handle that and be able to make all of your edit changes the same. So those are some of the things that we will see in Nuendo that aren't necessarily in Cubase. So I hope that helps. And again, there's pretty detailed comparisons that you could see on the Steinberg YouTube or Steinberg website. So I'll just exit out of Nuendo quickly and jump back to Cubase. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so we'll look at Okay, so we see a question, Greg, some words about how the audio grouping parts can be useful, Control G. So I'll just jump to a particular project quickly here. So what grouping and ungrouping will allow you to do is to just, take different parts. So if I wanted these parts here to always, let's say if I had split this particular part, so I'm going to hold down my shift key, select these two parts, and I'm going to hit Control or Command G. And once we do that, we see that these different tracks here are grouped. If we look in the upper right-hand corner here, we'll see this little icon indicating like that they're grouped. So what we could do now is, if I always wanted these two files to be linked together, so when I move one, that the other will move, and it's also handy. Let's say I'll show you in another file quickly. Like if you have different acoustic guitar tracks, for instance, where you have like two different microphones and they're not recorded as a stereo file, but you want it to be recorded as two mono files. We could just kind of, let's see, I think I have an example here. Let's say I have two different guitar parts. I could select these guitar parts here and group them. So Command G. And now whenever I move one guitar part, those two will kind of intrinsically be linked. And to ungroup them, all you'd have to do is hit Command or Control U for ungroup. And now they can be moved independently without the other one. So that's why you'd want to do different grouping. And you could see as different tracks are grouped or ungrouped, just so when I hit Command G, you'll see that little, icon in the upper window in the upper right hand corner, just to indicate that they are grouped. Okay. Okay, so going on through different questions here. All right. Okay, so we have, hi Greg, hope you're doing well. I am. My family's doing great as well. Thanks for asking. How do I sidechain bass and drums properly for EDM? What's the right way to do it? Any tricks? One of the things we did in version 10 was to kind of actually simplify that process. So I think I have a file that could show this pretty easily. Okay, so we'll come over here. And let's say I'll just make sure I'm not going to kill you volume-wise. That I wanted to sidechain this synth with the kick. So we hear kind of the sound now. So what I want to do is just go to my synth track. And if we go to, let's say, the insert, you could activate, most of the VST3 plugins have the capability of doing sidechaining. And we could activate the sidechain by clicking on this little icon here. And once we click to the right, we can now just add our sidechain input. So I'm going to say, let's take that kick drum. And I did a pretty obvious sidechaining, like a really heavy compression that's going to be triggered by the sidechain input of the kick. So that's something you could do. Now, you could also do some other aspects of sidechaining that could be creative as well. Like I did a tutorial video recently where you could actually do sidechaining of the noise gate. So if you have something, let me see, I probably have a project that we could show this as well. And this could be handy for doing some EDM stuff. Let me just... Let's see if I can find that particular file. If not, I will find it here. But okay, so if I have, let's say, just like a pad sound here. I'll adjust my control room up here. So what I could do now is just kind of take like a drum loop. Let's say I have a drum loop. And what I've done is I've taken the sidechain input on my actual pad shop here. So I went to the channel and I just turned on a noise gate. So, and what I've done is I've told like my kick track, let's say if I have a kick here, and I want to send this particular out, this through like a send on this track out to the sidechain. So if we listen to just... But now if I have that set to the sidechain, and what that's doing is basically turning on the kick to trigger the sidechain of the pad. And I could also bring in another track. So let's say I wanted to bring in this drum. So I'll take off the sidechain for the kick, but I have it for this loop. And you could do both as well. So you could say... And you can play around with some of the release of the sidechain. So those are some creative things you could do with sidechain. So not just using compressors, but also play around with noise gates. So if you want stuff to be very tight rhythmically, to like a drum loop, that's one way of being able to do it. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, so I see a question. How can I arrange the plugin collections in alphabetical order? So let's take a look. So your plugin collections is I'm not sure if you want to organize the plugins or the plugins themselves in alphabetical order. So we'll go to our VST plugin manager. And what a plugin collection is it's going to allow you to click on the plus sign, and we can have an empty plugin collection here. So I'll just call this Hangout. And then I could drag different plugins directly over into here. I could also make a folder. So I say these are my favorite EQ. And then if I wanted to double click or just drag these to the EQ folder, I could just say, you know, I like these. And now I could look at my EQ folder and just be able to, okay, you know, so you could organize everything. Now, when you look at this, so here it looks like it's in alphabetical order. When you put it in here, it's going to be in order. Let me see if there's any preferences. I think this might be set up not by alphabet, but maybe by the order dragged in. So let me see if there's any settings for that. So I don't know of a way to do that. So it might be by the order that they're dragged in. Let's just do a quick test. So let's say if I want to do auto pan, but it looks like you could maybe not do it, but you could drag and drop, but I don't know of a way to automatically have it just do it by alphabetizing. So if I'm misunderstanding the question, let me know, but you could drag and drop to kind of change the order within, but it may not just do it automatically for you. Okay, so we have a question: how can I improve my automation skills in Cubase? You know, so there's a lot of great stuff you can do automation-wise. We'll show you a couple of tips here. So let's, I'll just drag in just anonymous audio file here so we could see some automation. Okay, so if you know, when you come here, you know, a lot of people will be able to, you know, just go to the fader here, and you could use a controller, but really, you know, anything that you want, you click on the W, and if I wanted to write the automation, you can do it. Now there's a couple of different modes. One will be touch, so as soon as we you know, write, let's say, our automation in, we could do that. But you could also do something like a, you know, auto latch. So auto latch will keep writing that value in until you stop. And then there's going to be another automation mode where you can do crossover. So let's say if I have my automation point here, and if I'm in crossover mode, I can now just kind of bring it down. And then as soon as I bring it back up, you could just kind of have your automation. Now, a lot of people don't realize that some of the other parameters are available under settings. So let's say if I'm automating and I wanted to see this data here, we could just say show data on tracks, and I could see my automation data that I've done here, and I could see waveforms in the automation lanes. One thing that's also very handy to know is you could just, you know, if I'm in a particular file here, I go to my EQ. Let's say I started adjusting my EQ change here. And I have a lot of different automation going on in that particular file. Is you could have an option to reveal data parameters. on stop. So if I don't see any automation, so let's say I want to hide all of my automation, I move here and I started adjusting the EQs. I see a lot of people. All right, so we automated that data, and like, where is the automation? So going to F6 for the automation panel, just simply choose reveal parameter on right. So now as I have that checked, as soon as I move the parameters, that would just automatically show the automation parameters that have been written automatically. So that's really handy tip. If you wanted to, open up a particular automation event, a lot of times you can say, I wanted to automate this. You could, often, let's say if I was in, let's say, I wanted to automate, let's say the send level. You could also right click here and say show level automation track on a lot of different parameters by right clicking. And then that would automatically open up that automation lane. Once you do have if many people, once they're editing automation, you could also just kind of come here if you wanted to just, bump up like a vocal or get rid of a plosive. If you just used a range tool, you could do that. You could also tilt. You could create, different curves. So if you switch to kind of, you could have your Bezier curves. You could do that. And we could turn off snap so it doesn't seem as jagged. So you can... And if you find that, I really do this a lot, I want to add another point, and, we could zoom in. And, if this is like, let's say, different filter sweeps, you could come here and say, I really like this, and I just wanted to hit Control or Command D to duplicate the automation. You could do that. And if you have two automation points, one our tip is, once you have the cursor between two, you'll see a little diamond in the upper center. Then you could just change the particular values between two automation points. So you say, I like this, but it wasn't loud enough at that point. You could go directly to between and be able to increase or decrease. So those are a couple little automation tips that could help for EDM music. Okay, so we have a question from Taylor. Can you explain regions, how to set them up, some possible uses for them? All right, so let's say, this was... Just undo this. All right, so regions can be a very powerful tool in Cubase, and especially if you're doing like dialogue editing, or if you're doing stuff like, okay, I wanted to do like a book on tape. So if we come here, we could look at in this, I'm going to double click, and we could go to like our sample editor here. And what I'm going to do, I'll just do it in full screen. So I will just click on kind of the plus sign. And as we want to work with this, I could just come over here, and I'm going to activate my right-hand zone. And here we could see different regions. So let's say, let's see, I may have even I'll just see if I can import an audio file with some dialogue. So I think the folks at ESPN gave me some... Okay, so we'll just kind of come over here. All right, so let's say this is our new audio file. Just color it quickly. Okay, and I wanted to just be able to pull out different elements of an interview. So I'll just go ahead and...
unbelievable group into that group of 4-time champions. It's
Okay, so I will double click here, and again, we'll just launch it into our sample editor. So we'll go to our definition area. Okay, so what I want to do is to just be able to find different regions. So
I've been going to the racetrack for a long time, and you have too.
All right, so we can now click on our region sign here, and we could just type in, Bob talking intro, whatever.
I've been going to
Okay, so as we continue to play,
it just was a special day for all the wrong reasons and then all the right reasons. But walk us through that race a little bit.
Okay, so we can say, walk us through that race a little bit. I could just come here. Let's add a region. So, if you're doing, and you could do this for solos. Okay, let's come over here.
We had all these scenarios, and quite frankly, we weren't talking about you that much. I mean, as the media or as people are prognosticators about the weekend. And then all of a sudden, about halfway through that race, I remember very vividly someone in the media center going, Scott Dixon's going to win the whole thing. But at one point, did you realize the day was coming to you, and how was that build up for the few days leading in? When, quite honestly, we were talking to you some, but we weren't talking to you as much as we were to other guys.
Yeah, it was, for.
All right, so and we could add a region. Scott answer. So you could just kind of go through here and add different regions. So, if you're doing live recording, cleaning up, books on tape, stuff like that. Now, once we have this done, we could go into our pool window, and we'll see our audio files. And when we see, we can now see our different regions as we look at it here. So, and if I wanted to, I could choose to drag. I'll close the editor, and I could just have this particular region. Let me just drag it to an audio file. That'd be helpful. To an audio track, I'll just quickly add an audio track. And now Adobe wants me to update my Flash for some reason. Okay, so we'll come over here to the pool window. So I could take just that particular region and drop it right in. But also, once I have the region set, I could just come here. I could select these, and you could right click, and I believe if we just say there's like a bounce selection. So if I go to my audio submenu and say bounce selection, we could put them into a new folder, and then those would automatically be rendered as full WAV files instead of just the beginning and end of different regions. So those are a couple of different uses, and sometimes it could be used more for kind of some post-production stuff and cleaning up dialogue and stuff like that. But there's, good musical aspects as well. So, if someone was just noodling and they played an amazing part, you could, have someone just, who's just vamping, playing different stuff. You could capture regions as riff ideas and stuff like that. Okay, so next question we have is, hi, Greg. When using the time warp tool, I've noticed that sometimes it creates a tempo change to the left and right of the position I'm in. So let's go ahead and I will just edit this particular. I'll just drag a new file in just to kind of show this. All right, so when you start doing different warping functions, okay, so I'm going to double click here and we'll go into our warp tab. So we go to audio warp, and what you can do is just kind of come over here, and one of the cool things you can do is just enable free warp. So I could kind of see my grid here, and I'll switch my time into bars and beats. But if I want it this particular hit to be right on the bar, I could do that. But sometimes you may want to just put a kind of like a warp marker there, and then I could keep that part of the audio from moving forward. Then I could just snap that. And if I wanted this to be on the beat, move this over. So this is kind of, what you do, but you may want to have kind of a warp marker set as an anchor. So you could say, I want that to fall right there. I want this to be in between, and this will just kind of stretch the audio to automatically fit. So when you play it back, it's probably gonna be awful, but
for one, I don't really like
and I'll just go ahead and
to talk about myself too much, but I feel
so that's some of the stuff that you could do, but make sure that you kind of place an anchor. And I think if that's what you mean from kind of this sample editor, but there's also kind of a tempo warp, and you have a time warp tool. Sometimes, I guess, for a while they were really into the word warp at Steinberg from the marketing side. But what the time warp tool does, and it could be, maybe the question might be with this, is allow you to, position, particular measures, say this is where I want measure 151 and I want this part of the file. And what this does is it can stretch. You can basically choose where the file, where the downbeat is. Now, as we do this, we'll notice that this is in musical mode. So if I'm trying to move this around and I don't want this to change, I would just kind of place this not in musical mode. And I say, this is where measure 152 should fall. This is where measure 153 should fall. And this will put in the appropriate tempo changes to match. So I'm not sure if you're talking about the time warp tool or kind of warping in the sample editor, but that should help. Okay, going through more questions. All right. Okay, so we had a question, and it's kind of going back to sidechaining. Is there any way to get a reverb to behave the same way a sidechain delay does? I realize reverb doesn't have sidechain capabilities, but is there a workaround? So let me just jump to another project here. I think we could get this set up. So, and I'll put too much reverb on a source. So what I've seen people do is, let's say, and I'll just go to my effects channel. So let's say I'll just make this really wet. So what I've seen some people do is just kind of, put a compressor before the reverb in the reverb return channel, so in the effects channel track, and just be able to kind of compress that and be able to, let's say if I want it, and I don't really have a good source for this, but I'll take the sends of my piano part here, and be able to, let's just go to where I have the grand, and I wanted the sends to trigger that. So when I come here, this could sound really awful, but you could experiment with it. So you hear where the piano kind of stops. So if you go to the effects channel track, so I will just kind of pop here. Let's say, okay, let's go to our effects channel track where we have the reverence. and just put like a compressor before the effect, and then that will be sidechained, and that will open up the signal going into the reverence. So it's probably not the best demonstration file for it, but you could definitely work with that. Okay, so we see a question. When dragging samples to Groove Agent SE, what is the significance of each of the 3 pad positions? Okay. So I'll just load up a new VST track here with Groove Agent. And go to my media bay. Let's go to okay, so when I drag it over, I think one is going to replace it. If I, let's say if I do it as, so if I come here, I could add, so if I do that, okay, okay, so one would be like placing the sample in layers. One would be to replace. So I think if we do this, that replaces the sample. So we could drag it the first time. So the very first time it goes on a sample, we could layer it. When we see the 2 pads, it replaces all the other existing samples on there. And the third one seems to replace it. I could do some more research, but one allows you to layer, one allows you to replace the sounds. And I just off the top of my head forgot what the third one is, but it's in those kind of lines for thought. Okay, so we have hello from Southern Utah. Is there a way to print the Cubase click to audio in Elements 10.5? I'm not sure if this is in Elements, but how it's done in the Pro version is just to come over here, and if you have a signature track in your project, so let's say, okay, we're in 6/8, and I wanted this click pattern to be like dun 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 dun, like that. So as we play, let's turn on my click. But one of the things you could do is between, if we go to the signature track, see if the Elements version does it, this is the way to do it. You could just simply say, render audio click between locators. So I have my left and right locator here, and you could just simply do that, and that would automatically render the click track. If it's not available, that function isn't available in the Elements, which it could be not available. I know people that will simply take the outputs from their audio interface, play the click track, and just take the outputs and plug it back in and just record the audio out of the click. So that's one way of doing it. Some people will what I used to do in the old days is I had samples of the click, and I would load those into Groove Agent. And once I would load it into Groove Agent, I would just have different click patterns, and then within the pattern pads, and then I could just simply drop that in and render it as a VST instrument. So that's another method that you could use for that. But if you have the pro version, I know it's in there. So if you get to the project menu to the signature track, it's kind of an automated process, which is really helpful to a lot of people. I think they brought that into Cubase 9.5. Okay. Question, is a newer version of VST Connect compatible with 9.5? Yes, it is. So, okay, so we have a question. Is there a way to zoom into the WAV file that's been dragged into the sampler track? I believe so. Let's give it a shot. So we'll do that. I think it's the same way. So once this is the active zone, and you could switch what is the active zone by hitting the tab key. So I could have the lower zone, the right zone, the left zone. We see this white outline. I could see the project window. So once I'm here, I think you could just kind of use the same editing functions here. So if you just wanted to zoom in, you could, let's see if and you could just, once that's the active zone, you could just hit G and H to be able to trigger that very easily. Or you could just kind of navigate and zoom, kind of the drop zoom functionality that we see that's pretty common throughout Cubase and the editors. Okay. Thanks for all the great questions. Says, hi, Greg. I have something simple. I can't figure out how can I have the cursor always follow selection without having to press L every time. So let me just make sure I'm understanding this. So it says it works that way in other programs. So let's see. How can I always have the cursor follow selection? Could be a preference. Let me just check. Maybe under editing. Okay, so let's say I'll just swing back to a project that has some usable music in it. All right. Okay, so I'm just so let's say I'm playing this. Says, how can I have the cursor always follow selection? So I think if you hold down Alt and Shift, so wherever you kind of click while holding down Alt and Shift, I'm not sure if this is what you want to do, but if I click anywhere while holding down Alt Shift, Cubase will play back from that position. Same time I have the object selection tool. So I click here, if I click on this part. And why they have a modifier is because obviously you may want to select events without having to have, the timeline, automatically adjust to that. So if you wanted to play back from, known positions. Whatever you did, that was okay. So if I'm misunderstanding, just shoot me a quick comment. So, okay, so another question. Hi, Greg. When I split a MIDI bass note in order to have it sound twice, pluck twice, it doesn't sound the second part. Okay, so let me just create that scenario. And this is a preference, I think, that will do the trick for you. See if my mouse is going to cooperate. Maybe my battery might be going low. So let's say if I have, just do a quick instrument track, and I'll just do like a pad shop sound. Okay, so let's say if I have a pad that's being held down, so I'm going to just create kind of a blank part here, and we'll draw in just a long note. All right, so the question is, if I have this part, and then you want to, when you split the event, I'm just going to make sure, when I split a MIDI bass note, in order to have it sound twice, doesn't sound the second note. So let me just come here. I'll hold down the Alt key, and we'll see if that... So that seems like it triggered the event, but if you run into scenarios, and what I thought your question might be, and I may be misunderstanding it, is I get this question a lot, is if I have one note and I split it on the project window, that often it won't re-trigger that note. So we get to this part here. And there's a preference to be aware of. So when you go to editing, to MIDI, to split MIDI events. So what this is going to allow you to do is, if you don't have this enabled, when I come here, we don't see that MIDI event here. We see this MIDI event that kind of extends over. So check that preference. If you've cut from kind of the project window level, under editing MIDI, to split MIDI events, and see if that helps you. Okay, so so I see a question. How can I print out chord charts from the chord track? So let's say I have a chord track here. There's a couple ways of doing this. I could, if you're doing a lead sheet, or you just want to do a chord chart for people, you could actually create a blank MIDI part. So I will come right here, and so I'm just going to create just an empty MIDI part. So when we go into our score editor, so I have my chords laid out in my chord track at the top of the project. So I wanted to give this to different musicians. I'll take this and we'll go to our page mode. And once we go to page mode, you could go to your scores and go to advanced layout. And at this point, you could just say show chord track, and then that will automatically kind of lay the chords in for you. Now I had another question that was kind of emailed in. So, and what they want to do is to be able to take all the chords, and let's say if this was a grand staff, I could come here, let's go to my polyphonic tab, and we'll do split staff at C3. Okay, so, and if you wanted, what they wanted to do, I think, was to select all the chords and move it in between the bass and treble clef. And if you wanted to, and they're looking for a keyboard shortcut to do that. And I don't think there's a keyboard shortcut, or one that I couldn't find. But if you hold down Shift and double click, that will select all the chords. And then if you wanted to move them in between the staves, you could do that as well. So to show the chord track, you could do it over an existing part, or create an empty part. Go to your scores, to advanced layout, and just check show chord track. Okay, let's move on. Thanks for everyone's great questions. Appreciate it. All right. Okay, so we have a question, pitch shift automation on audio files. So, there's a couple ways of being able to do this. One is, I'll just revert this project here since I probably destroyed it. Okay, so one of the cool things that you could do, if you could have, and it could be done a couple different ways, but one could be through a transpose track. So you could add a transpose track, and I could just come here. And then, and let's say your drums have completely transposed and you didn't want the drums to transpose, you could actually, select kind of the drum events and say global transpose independent. So now when I come here, we could just do, transpositions and our groove agent tracks and won't pitch shift up. So you could just kind of go right back to the original key. And we'll have it transpose up a major second. So that's one way of being able to automate kind of pitch shifting for your tracks globally. So I'm not sure if you want to do pitch shifting of samples or tracks like that. Maybe if you could comment, we might be able to circle back, but we'll see how many questions we have. Okay. Hi, Greg. When does Nuendo 10 will have color mixer tracks? I'm not sure if it's going to come in the Nuendo 10 lifecycle or maybe in the next version of Nuendo. It hasn't been announced yet. I would likely think it would be coming in the next version. And if you're not familiar, that would allow you to have your mix channels colorized. So if you wanted to have that kind of all throughout the mixer channel, we could do that as well. So I wouldn't anticipate it coming into the Nuendo 10 lifecycle, but I could be wrong. Okay, it says, hey, Greg, previously I had a question for you. You said to me to email you about it as you look into it. I don't have your email. Is it posted somewhere? Is about forward rewind with the mouse wheel. Yeah, you could email me at clubcubase@steinberg.de. And I think you mentioned that you had like the left and right mouse button configured, maybe with your mouse software, where you hold that down and move the mouse scroll wheel. So it's probably not necessarily a Cubase function, but I could be wrong, but maybe it's something that configured with your mouse that maybe like the mouse software allows you to do that when holding it down, but I don't think it's necessarily a Cubase function, or if Cubase would block it for some reason. All right. All right, we have a question from BC Canada, wondering about the use of VST Cloud. I've got Cubase Pro 8.5. One of the things that the VST Cloud will allow you to do is to have the VST Connect SE. So, and this is good during our stay home era, where you could, remotely record different people online and see them over the webcam. So there's a new version that was just introduced last week. So and that seems to be helping people that were having issues with it before to be a little more stable. So that's kind of what the VST Cloud options will allow you to do. Okay, so okay, question. Is it possible to save a drum map and not load it anytime? Yeah, so once you have a drum map, these are all just kind of stored. So let's say if I wanted to just have that particular drum map. You could, the drum maps, I think you could come here. Once you have drum maps created, they could just simply show up as presets. I used to make drum maps way back when. So you could, I think you could, within here, maybe functions. So here you could load and save different drum maps. So they don't have to be used, but so it's not as obvious as other windows. So once you get to the functions window here, just load and save your drum maps independently of the project. Okay, so we have a question. How reliable is the video export function? Because today my exported video had some codec problems. I think it uses kind of the most widely, compatible, codecs. And video files are a bit different than most audio files. Like a WAV file will play back in any product that plays back a WAV file. But, with video files, you're going to need to, different video applications can get can read it. You can read it or not read it based upon, the codec that compresses and decompresses, co for compressor, and D and then deck for decompression, and different container formats. Check to see if you play the video file fine within your operating system, like in QuickTime or in Windows Media Player. Then that would be indicative that maybe it's the application it's not seeing it, but it's kind of using H.264. It's a very, very common codec. So I haven't run into any problems with that. Okay, I think we may have covered this a little earlier. How much disk space does a typical installation of Pro require? So it could be 21. I think the download is 21 gigabytes, and that's with all the sounds and content. If you do just the main application, it's, I think, a few hundred megabytes maybe. But it's not huge, and you could, using the Steinberg library manager, if you needed to move content to another drive, if your hard disk is getting full, you could do that quite easily. All right, question. How can I get Cubase 10 elements to read my files from Cubase 7 elements? They load up, so you could take, your file form. You don't have to do any special importing. Just simply go to open. Depending on the versions you may run into, you may get a message saying, can't load this plugin because, from Cubase 9 or 9.5, they stopped bridging 32-bit plugins, and a lot of projects from Cubase 7 and earlier were running 32-bit versions still. It was pretty common in that era, but they caused a lot of system stability issues. But the file formats are compatible from SX1 and Nuendo 1, and SX1 was 2001, and those files will open up directly into Cubase 10. So you shouldn't have any problems from Cubase 7 to Cubase 10 unless it's kind of a plugin that is not happy. Okay, so we'll come here. Let's see. So, hey, Greg from Sacramento, Patrick W. Is there a way to close all plugin windows? I think there is. I probably will spend 10 minutes looking for it, so I won't do that. But let me just see if I... All right, so I have enough windows open. And let me just see if there's a key command that's set up for it. And I'm pretty sure there's a way of doing it. Okay, so if you come here, let's see if this works. Yeah. So if you go to key commands and under mixer, you'll see a Windows close all plugins, and you could set up your own user key command for that. So there's a new one. I'm glad when I don't know an answer and I could look it up and it works. Makes me appreciate our developers in Germany. Okay. So we have a question. Could you go through some of the uses of drawing in the waveform on the editor, please? Thanks from the Paul in the UK. Okay, so let me just okay, so there's a couple of different ways that you could do like with the drawing tool on waveforms. So if I have okay, so let's say if I wanted to I'll just make this a little larger. Okay, so if you wanted to get to the point where you wanted to just draw volume changes, and we had a question kind of sent in of, is there a way to see kind of the dB values as you draw in kind of the with the volume envelope with the pencil tool? So it really isn't represented in dBs. So you can make parts louder or softer. So you could do that with kind of the pencil tool right there. So if you want to do that. Now, another way of doing it using the pencil tool and drawing tool is when you zoom in the sample editor. So sometimes you may have just like a little spike, like maybe a sample dropout. So here, if you zoom in, and if you try to use the pencil tool here, you'll get kind of an annoying message saying, please zoom to a resolution. So you get to be kind of fairly well zoomed in. But here, you could just, if you had like a click or a pop, you could draw those out or draw them in as I'm doing. And I think if you hold down Shift or maybe Alt, that you could do it. That there was a modifier key to do it to both channels on the waveform. So that's what you could do. So you could draw in kind of volume changes, or zoom in to near the sample level in an audio editor to draw out, if you had a clocking noise or, a click or pop that was captured in the audio file, you could just simply come in and draw it out if you need to do repair of waveforms. Okay. What is the difference between using an effects track with a reverb versus using the reverb and an insert on, say, an instrument track? I'm confused. All right, so when you have, an effect that's, let's say, and I'll just revert this quickly. So when you're using an effect as an insert on an instrument channel, what you're actually doing is it's going to be dedicated just to that one particular instrument. So if I'm here and I wanted to have the same reverb on the guitar and the vocal, Here I could use, you know, I could go to the same reverb, so it sounds like they're in the same room. So these are both going to the same reverb on the effects channels. So that way you could have kind of, you know, them sounding the same. So you got multiple tracks going to one instance of a reverb versus multiple instances of a reverb. And just to make sure, sometimes I get this question a lot, is what's the difference between using an effects track with a reverb or using it as an insert on not on necessarily an instrument track as was asked in the question, but on a group track. And they're functionally the same. There used to be like some very minor differences, but I think but you know, I think 99% between you know, a group track and a reverb and effects channel track would be, you know, the same. So, but okay, so we have a question. My Cubase 10.5 crashes when I use the MIDI monitor. If you're not familiar with what the MIDI monitor plugin does, you know, it's a MIDI effect plugin. So we go to your MIDI inserts, and what the MIDI monitor plug does is it will just come here, and as I move a knob or controller, it will display what's going on. Now, if you have crashes, I've seen some people that when they turn the MIDI monitor plugin on, it could capture so much data if you have like a MIDI feedback loop of some kind. Like if something is just generating a ton of MIDI data, like, you know, sending like a lot of sysx information, or if it's just constantly like in a MIDI loop where it's just pinging out a zillion, you know, MIDI messages at one point. So if you see that from a MIDI monitor from like one device but not another device, it could be that MIDI controller is spitting out just gobs of information and creating a feedback loop. So I've seen that with some synthesizers, you know, or maybe like a MIDI CC is kind of stuck and the knob is kind of just transmitting constantly and it's sending so much data that it could just kind of crash the operating systems of, you know, for MIDI buffers. So check that and see if it does it with every different device or with only one particular controller. And I think you can narrow it down. Okay. Okay, so we have a question. Is it possible to create a shortcut to glue to selected MIDI parts? Obviously, without using the glue tool. Thanks. I think this might have been added in 10.5. So let's take our MIDI event here. So let's say we select it, and let's say I cut, and I wanted to join these two parts together. And we did this kind of especially with the smart tools. I think if we go to your key commands, and this is probably going to be under edit. And just glue. So I'll just come here. All right, and my son is visiting. All right, I'll just get through this. All right, so now I'll just come here, and that's a dedicated glue function without having to switch tools. All right, I'm going to check with my son very quickly. Bear with me. Thanks for your patience. All right, my son's movie's finished, so he's going to try to play a card game. Okay, sorry about the disruption. All right, so yeah, there is the function to, you can assign a key command just to glue functions together without having to switch tools. Okay. Okay, so we have a question. Hi, Greg. Is there a way to play chords and have the chord you play display without having to play it and highlight it to display on the side? Okay, so so question is there a way to play chords and have the chord you play display without having to play it and highlight it to display on the side? So let me just, I may not be understanding correctly. So let's say if I have this particular part here, I think we could maybe in this setup page here, that if you look here and on the top, so if you want to see it within the editor, you could select like a range of chords and you could see what the chord is here. So if I wanted to select that, so you can see kind of the current chord display within the editor. There's obviously, so I'm not sure, you say you want to play the chords and have the chord you play display without having to play it and then highlight it to display on the side. If you have the chord track turned on here, you just say MIDI input and play chords. I'll just play some random, chords here. This will kind of tell you what chord you're playing with, and you could add that to the chord track, but you could also do it within the editor. But I'm probably, I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding the question, how you to play it and then have the chord you play display without having to play it. So sorry for not understanding. Okay, so we have VK checking in from Baltimore, not far from me. Okay. Okay, so we have a question, how to install the massive library that comes with Hallion. I'm sorry, just once I hang out, my chat window just goes crazy and just jumped like 18,000 comments ahead. Okay, just kind of scrolling back. Sorry. Okay, so hi, how to install the massive library of Hallion, etc. on an external SSD. So once you have Cubase, one of the programs that's installed with it would be called the Steinberg Library Manager. So all you really have to do is we'll just open this up, and you can go to all the Steinberg content. Say you wanted the electric bass. At this point, you could say move, and then just move that to choose a different folder and move it. And that's really all you have to do. Then all the internal links to Cubase will automatically be carried through, and those sounds could be accessed. Okay. How do I bounce a full track? My main DAW is Logic Pro X. So if you wanted to do a mix down, what you want to do is make sure that you have the left and right locators, and this determines the beginning and the end of the file. And at this point, you could just go to file menu to export and do an audio mix down. If you wanted to do a single file, you could say you just want it to stereo out. Here you pick a file name, where you want it to be saved to, and then export. Or you could do, you could select multiple, and this would allow you to make stems quite easily. So once again, you go to your file menu to export audio mixdown. Okay, moving on. Thanks for everyone's great questions. Okay, let's just keep going. Okay, so I see question, MIDI loops sounds different auditioning in a media bay directed to the plugin than on the track itself. So let's take a quick listen to it. Let's see if I can find some quickly. So I'll just... All right, so that's a quick MIDI loop. So I'm going to... Okay, so I'll just take this little electric piano. All right, I'll just reset that quickly. All right, so let's say I'll just solo just that electric piano. So that kind of sounds the same to me when we do that. You know, it could be that the, you know, if it sounds different, maybe you're using it and it's going through like the master effects, you know, when you put it into project, but not when you are auditioning it. So it could be something like that. But it's kind of sounds the same to me. And if you have a particular MIDI loop, you could email me at clubcubase@steinberg.de. Okay. Says, I wondered when I did an audio mix down, the WAV file was lowered in tune and slower. It worked somehow, but I don't know how I sorted out eventually. You talk about it. Okay. So probably what you did is I would assume that your project was at probably 48K or 96K sample rates. And we could determine that just by going to the project setup, which you could access from the project menu, or by hitting Shift S. When you export it, this happens often when you export like a project that's at 48K and you do your audio export and it's at 44.1K. So that would be, it's not quite one note. It's a little less than one semitone down. So it sounds a little bit out of tune. So it's a pretty common thing. So I think you just have a sample rate mismatch from your project to the file that you exported. Okay, and we had some questions that were mailed in. One of the questions was kind of dealing with when we see a number of different files and we want to navigate. So I'll just revert this quickly. Okay, so, and the question was kind of on, let's say we come here, we could see our project length, and let's say, I think by default it's 10 minutes, but let's move it to 20 minutes here. So now we could advance the project here, and the question was that they really only wanted this for the, you know, to have the end point so that, you know, they didn't necessarily need to scroll for 13 minutes after the project. And this is really just kind of set by the project length in the project setup. So if I come here, I could just right click and we'll look at seconds. So let's say, you know, I have a song that's let's say this project's like 2 minutes, 20 seconds. So if I go to my project setup and I set this to 3 minutes long, now when I navigate, it's only going to allow me to navigate within a 3-minute section. So if I have, so if you wanted this to, make a little more sense, and my son's going a little crazy upstairs. All right. You could just simply change the project length and the project setup. So you'll see project duration, rather, it's the term. Okay. Let's come over here. Keep going through questions. Thanks everyone for great questions. All right, so question, is it possible to save panning presets? Thanks again. So not necessarily, if you're looking for, the panning values can be preserved within the track presets. So what I know a lot of people do, for working with different projects is, just simply, if you start off with a template, you could say, I want this to be panned that way and that way. And then as you start, building tracks from a template, those pannings are automatically going to be preserved, either from, being in a project or being a part of the template, but there aren't panning presets necessarily. So, but if you save a track preset, that would include the panning. Okay, so we have a question. Is there a way to have Cubase not boot up with missing content error messages if an external drive with content is not connected? There are times it would be useful to use Cubase without the VSTs. Currently not, but I did make sure, I had someone ask me this question at the NAMM show when one of the developers was standing next to me, and I made sure that the developer understood the need for a, say no to all messages option for all the content. So it doesn't keep, if you have a large sample library. So I don't know a way of currently doing it, but I know that the developers are aware of it and are looking to perhaps change that. So, I had some conversations with them in January at the NAMM show in Anaheim, California. Okay. Okay, so a question, how to optimize the sample library in Media Bay so that everything loads fast. I still have to wait like 10 seconds for it to show up. One of the things that you could do in the Media Bay is, one thing is people often have it checked for every single folder. If you have, folders that don't have any audio, simply go into this computer and make sure that, particular folders where you're not going to have content aren't checked, because it doesn't do any good to have it looking for the folders. Sometimes I see just people who have never gotten a complete Media Bay scan where it's still kind of constantly scanning. And I think there's a preference. So if we go to the preferences and under Media Bay, where you could say, try and make sure that the scan folders only when Media Bay is open isn't checked. And that could also help as well. If you have tens of thousands of, audio files and samples and presets, also try increasing the maximum items in the result list as well. So, make sure that it's not every time that you open up Media Bay that it's not choosing to only scan at that point with that preference. Okay, so we have a question also, is there any way to rename and save a groove quantize preset for later use in our project? Once you kind of drag over the groove, you can come here and let's just take a look, see if we could rename it. So I'll drag this window over here. So once you have, it looks like once you're here, we can go to the quantize setup. So we see the quantize preset here, and then you could choose to rename the preset. So you can call it Hangout April 7th. And then you could just rename it, and then you could use that in any project. Okay, let's go through. Okay, so just reading through different questions. Thanks for everyone's. Okay, so I see a question. Is it possible to drag and drop multiple audio files in Groove Agent? I think you can. But I think if you're doing it from the media bay, so let's come here. I think maybe I have a Groove Agent open, maybe not. All right, so we'll add a Groove Agent SE. So let me just drag a couple of samples in. So I don't think that you can drag multiple files. Oh, yeah, we just did it from Media Bay here. So now let me see if I could. So let's see if I drag these to where we see 3. Okay, so with the getting back to our 3 questions. So if I come here, let's say I select a number of different files from my media bay, I could go here and I see my multiple files, and then I could select the bank, and then when it's on 3, I think that automatically spreads each of the samples. So yeah, so it's pretty easy to do. So you have different drum samples. You could just select them in Media Bay and drag it over. And then I think if we put it at 2, it's going to add all the samples to one pad. If we see 3, right, just getting annoyed with Adobe. All right. So if I see 3, what that's going to do, and this goes back to our question earlier, that will automatically spread those across multiple pads. So I could just come here, select all these samples, drag them over. So with 3 dots, it's going to automatically fill those particular pads. So, yep, you can do it. I was wrong. Okay, so we have a question. How can I paint a MIDI snare when setting the snap to half? A snare does not usually land on the first beat of a bar. So let's come here. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I'll start here on. I'll change this to half notes, and I want to paint. All right, so let me undo that, and I'm just going to change this to half notes here. Okay, so let's see, you want it to be okay, let me just try one here to quarter notes. All right. And I think my project I'm doing this in is in 6/8, so I'm a dummy. Okay, so let's say my snare. All right, so let's say, so if I have it set to half note and you don't want it on the 4, so let's say if I put this to whole note and see, there are some tricks. So I see what you want to do here, where you want it to start on here and have it every other note. So there are like some logical editor presets where you could select every other note. I know it's kind of a workaround. Let's see if I could get it set up quickly. So let's say we wanted to delete. I'll just start with selecting. Type is equal to note, and if we do a last event, we could say, I think it's, so let's say if I just quickly do this, but there's a logical editor preset, and I probably just for getting what to do where you could do that. But I think you wanted to start, let's say, the snare on beat 2 and draw it in and not have it be on 1 and 4, so kind of offsetting. And if you come here, another way you might be able to accomplish this is, let's say, we had it for whole notes like this. And then just to use the nudge palette here for half notes. So if you come here, so I see what you want to do, and I can pass that along as well. All right, so we'll move on. Okay, so we have a question. How come Cubase sets all faders all the way down and panned hard left whenever you add a new set of MIDI tracks? So when we come here, it's because there's kind of two different ways of getting MIDI volume to instruments that are being sent to virtual instruments. One is using, so if I add a instrument, let's just say if I come here and I start with an instrument rack, and I added retrolog, I'll get this prompt that do we want to create a MIDI track. So it's going to add that MIDI track, route that to retrolog, and do this. So I still have control over the retrolog here as my virtual instrument, but I also have a MIDI volume control. So many people prefer this for the volume, because this will also tie you directly into, your automation and EQs, and use this for volume. So a lot of people tend not to use the MIDI volumes unless it's specifically written in. And we have a lot of composers will do that for kind of MIDI orchestration. So that's why it kind of defaults there. So it could be a little less confusing for instruments that are, until it actually sees a MIDI volume message, then it will react to that. So, being that there could be two separate volumes, one for the audio aspect of one for the MIDI, that's why it's kind of has that distinction. Okay. Okay, so let's check out coming over here, see if I can get something. So a question about pan control after kind of splitting mono and stereo tracks. Just find something. Okay, so let's say I have this selected, and we come over here to our project, and we'll do a convert tracks. For some reason this behaves weird on my end. So I have my audio here. So I have my pan control just right there. So it looks like, my pan control is still accessible. So, and then if I wanted to just look at this, and it could be, because these are being routed out to just the left and right. So if I set this to the stereo out, because it's being bused to a mono output. So if you check the output, now that we have it going to the stereo out, you can adjust. So it's a little odd, I'll grant you, and I'll mention that to see if that could automatically be incorporated. Okay. Okay, so let's go through some more. Okay, so it says I have a problem with my MIDI keyboard on Cubase 10 when I use a VST instrument. For example, Groove Agent, I have no sound. So, when you have a MIDI keyboard, you'll see like on the transport, like this little light here, which will indicate that it's getting MIDI data. You want to make sure that if, you have the MIDI enabled, like to pass MIDI directly here. So if I go to my retro log track, I will just load up a quick preset here so it doesn't play. It's just a beautiful sine wave. All right. So, as soon as we have, that MIDI data, being sent, you could check to see if you have, sound directly in the keyboard when you play it. But a lot of times it's, make sure that your keyboard is communicating and that the track is armed here, because that tells it to pass the MIDI input signal, and also check your MIDI inputs and see if that is set correctly as well. Okay, so let's go on. All right, can Cubase mix to a set loudness units, a LUFS target? So when you actually want to, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. One is that you could, see your loudness meters here. So once you have your metering going on, I'll just switch to a different project. So we've been using kind of loudness units for metering for a long time. So if we have our project here and it's all in the control room section, we could go to your meter and then you can see your loudness units. Just jump back to the part where I didn't destroy the song. And we'll turn on our loudness unit metering. So if you've done an export to the particular file, so let's say if I come here, I think way at the bottom, there's like maybe a mix down track. Okay, so if I wanted to take this file and have it be kind of the perfect loudness units, if we go to your audio to processes, and then when we do our normalize, you'll have settings, and this came in 10.5, where you could set the value in either dB or in loudness units. So I can say I want this to be minus 23 LUFS, and that will automatically normalize the file to loudness units. So while Cubase doesn't do it, you may not want it to do it on the export, but you could take that file and process it and just run it through the normalize, and you can set the mix down values to loudness units there. Okay. Okay, let's kind of go through and read some more questions. So I see a quick question. Can you create a tempo track with all tempo variations automatically from an audio track? So really all you have to do is select it. And at that point, just go to your project menu, and there's an automatic tempo detection function, and that will make a tempo map of your existing file. So project to tempo detection. Okay. Okay, so it says, I've read about parallel or New York style compression, but never tried it. If you are familiar with the technique, would you mind demonstrating it? Nope, not at all. So let's take a quick look. It's kind of a misnomer that it was a New York style. I think one of the first people to use it was a guy named Bob Dennis, who recently passed away. He's a wonderful mastering engineer in Detroit area, and he did a lot of the great Motown records. And if you wonder why Motown records always, you hear the bass and the vocals very clearly, because he was doing very early kind of parallel processing. So he was probably one of the pioneers, but a lot of people call it New York processing. All right, so I'm going to come here and let's do it on a drum bus. I'll just hide my input channels, and let's say we're listening to our drums. So what I want to do is to take all of my drums. I'm going to take these drum tracks here. I'm going to select them. And then I'm going to right click into faders, and I'm going to add a group channel to the selected channels. And I'll just go ahead and do that twice, and we're going to make it a stereo group. Okay. And we're going to choose to create outside the folder, and that will place these two groups just to the right of our selections. Okay. So now when we go to look at our tracks, all right, so we could do this, and we see that's going to be going into this bus. So if I drop this bus channel, this will be all my drums. So the trick is to send it to 2 different destinations at once. And we can do this kind of in the full mix console view. And there's a little rack over here that's kind of a hidden gem called direct routing. And then what we want to do is to go to our direct routing, and this little drop down menu, very subdued thing that's so powerful. We want to make sure that we have direct routing mode on. So what I'm going to do is we can see that we're going to have our routing for the drum tracks is going to be set to, group 2 here. So I will just kind of take all these tracks, and I'm going to very easily, let me just hide my inputs again in this view. So we'll select all my drums, let's say from here to here. And we're going to send these all to group 1. I'm going to just hold down Alt-Shift, and that will send it all to the same destination. And then I want to send these to, we could even do here our normal stereo out. And then we want group 1. And then we also will hold down Alt-Shift for group 2 and turn that on. So right now we're going to have our drums playing into 2 different groups. And because we chose to do direct routing summing, at this point, what I want to do is to take this group, and I just wanted to apply like a really heavy compression on it. And I'll do some extra makeup gain on it. And sometimes people will do like just a bit of EQ on the... All right, so my bass got included in that, so I'll just turn that off. All right. So let me just take my bass out since I was aired. So now what I have is one group that has been like really heavily kind of crunched down. And I'll just kind of... So what you want to do now at this point, we could have those tracks going to the group and then blend in the group with all the compression and kind of find the sweet spot. So this group would have more of the attacks, and this group could be a little more settled. So that's what parallel compression would allow you to do. So again, make sure that you have the direct routes, the direct rack enabled in the racks menu. To the little drop-down menu, turn the summing on, send the tracks to both of those destinations, and then kind of compress one and just go straight down and find that sweet spot. So see a question, can I make a Tupac beat in Cubase? So you can make any kind of beat you want in Cubase. Okay. Okay, so quick question. Kindly take me through a multi-panner workflow and setup in Cubase. So this is often where we have a multi-panner setup. So let's say in our audio connections in my project, if I have a 5.1 output, so Cubase will do up to 5.1. So if I add an audio track, I could come right over here, see this, and if we route this to our 5.1 out, now when I go to the channel, we'll have our 5.1 panner here. So if we have an ambisonics, and this is kind of a different beast, but we could also have an ambisonics output under more. So let's say I wanted a second order ambisonics or first order. And I route this track to my ambisonics bus, and this allows you to do more 3D positional audio. That's how you could use that. So really, you need to have the audio connections, you need to have those outputs defined, and when you route that, the panner will route accordingly. All right, I'm going to jump over because I know we had some people that had sent some questions in, so let's see if we could go through some of those. Okay, so it says I have trouble using quantize in Cubase for setting the proper end of MIDI notes. The start always gets quantized perfectly, but the lengths of the notes don't. So when we want to do quantization of MIDI parts, we can right-click here. We'll go to our MIDI track. And as we do this, let's just draw in my MIDI data here. And we will just have our notes. Let's just draw in all right, so if I wanted to quantize kind of the actual, not just the start of the events, but the lengths. So we could do this. I think if we just go over here to edit, and we'll choose quantize and go to advanced quantize. And so if I just come here and I have my quantize value set to, let's say, a quarter note. When I hit Q, these will snap to the nearest quarter note. So we undo that. And if we come here, we could just go to edit to advanced quantize, and we can say quantize the event lengths. Now we have the beginning of the notes not actually affected, but the lengths of the notes were quantized. So that could be really handy for pads and stuff like that. We're good here. Okay, so all right, we got back with our Hangout. Okay, so as soon as we do that, then you could have independent quantization for the lengths, the ends, or if you just do a straight quantize, that will be for the beginning of the notes. Okay, another question that was sent in. So is there an easy way to save an arranger track setup for easy recall in other projects? Currently, there's not a great way of doing that, but if I have an arranger track set up here, so if we want to do kind of a non-linear pattern-based, and I wanted to have another project, and I'll just do an empty project here. All right. My son's starting to lose some patience. All right. What I could do is just select these arranger events, copy, just Command C. And then when we go to my other project, I could add an arranger track, let's say to this one. I'll activate this. And then I could paste those events. So it's not ideal. It's not included in the import tracks from project, but that could be perhaps a workaround. Okay. So it says, I have a question regarding customizing MIDI controllers to work with Cubase. Specifically, I have a machine jam controller. I'd like to create a template to use inside of Cubase to control the mixer with the touch strips and be able to customize 64 buttons to invoke specific key commands and, if possible, control transport. So the best, so it says, what's the best way for this? An MCU transport template, Mackie Control Lite, or just use generic remote inside Cubase to map all the controls. It comes with a controller editor, but it's best to create a generic remote inside Cubase. So if you wanted to take incoming MIDI messages and have it do different functions, the best way is to create a generic MIDI remote. So we can go to our studio setup and let's go to a generic remote here. And what I could do is basically we say we want, an incoming MIDI message. So I could say, I want it, a note. So I just hit C on my computer keyboard, and I want this note, this MIDI message to automatically, you set your, input and output for the controllers. It's probably a good thing to do first. So you could capture the incoming MIDI note. So if I wanted that MIDI note to control, transport, I wanted it to go to my device, and I wanted this to do start and stop or record. So at this point, I'll just say we're going to start. And I think my mouse battery is dying on me. So, and if I did this right, I could just, hit that particular note and have that function. So once you kind of have, your MIDI note messages configured here, so I'll just learn this. We just do a different MIDI note. So, and then you could just simply have that control do it. So the best way to do that would be kind of setting up the generic MIDI remote controller under your studio setup. And then you could, have, let's see, a number, it looks like 16, so like 64 devices per generic remote, and you could have multiple generic remotes mapped to the same controller. Okay, moving on to some other questions. Thanks everyone for their patience. I hope everyone's learning a tip or trick. So if you learned something new, feel free to go ahead and click on the thumbs up to like the Hangout. Okay, so we have a question on, can we explain how the highlight colors work? And they were kind enough to send me kind of like a little Facebook link. So it says, okay, so can you please explain how the highlight colors work in the preferences box? I think what they want is when a channel is selected, they want this color to be changed. Now, there is a preference. So if we come over here, if we go to preferences and under user interface, and we go to or it might be under event display. No. So if you go here to custom colors, there is, different ways if you wanted to change. And I want to say there's one of these for like the active. But I think what the maybe see if this is it. So when I hit tab, and we'll close out this preference, that when it highlights different areas, that this will be blue. So, I think what the question wants is for this color to change, but I think it's really important to distinguish obviously what the selected track is as opposed to kind of the outline here. So that preference is kind of to indicate which zone is currently active. So I'll just kind of jump back to my preferences and reset that because I think the white kind of makes sense. So I will come here and let's just go to our defaults for that and hit OK. Okay, another question. I'm composing a song which has a short rest between sections. The rest does not follow metronome time and thus will completely throw out syncing as the grid remainder of my composition. Is it possible to stretch the space between the two tempo points in a grid in order to create the rest length I desire while maintaining the synchronization to the grid? Is it possible to do this without tempo track? I hope my question makes sense. I think I understand kind of what you want to do. So let's take a look at it. So let's go to a MIDI track. And I will and let's say, on the big picture of things that this is, part of a song. I'll take my grid off temporarily. And I'll say this is the second part of a song. So what you can do, let's say I move this event closer to here. I think, what I know composer friends do in this situation where, I'm just going to have a pause here, but I want measure 12 to start here, is just using the time warp tool. So, but just kind of coming here and saying, this is where measure 12 is, and this is where measure 11 ends. And then you can just simply reposition the measure to actually fall. And this will insert a tempo change. But this way you can say, okay, when this song starts, it's going to be right on the downbeat, and then my grid is aligned. And then I think if you hold down different modifier keys, let's see. Try to remember what the modifier key is, but you could have that automatically kind of be the same tempo. So try using the time warp tool, and then you could move the downbeat to wherever you need to in the particular project. Okay, so we have a question. I'd like to understand why the insert silence function doesn't move the markers to the beginning of a bar if I have some tempo modulation. So let's go ahead and give that a try. Okay, so we have some tempo variations here. I'll zoom out to a normal resolution here. Okay, and you said we had some marker tracks. And let's say if I had an audio file, okay, so I'm just going to read this. I'd like to understand why the insert silence function does not move the markers to the beginning of a bar if I have some tempo modulation. Okay, so let's say I'll come here. Let's put in. Okay, so I think maybe what you'd want to do is to, let me just place some markers here as well. So if you go to the marker track and you have the range tool, there's kind of different functions where if I select the range on the track and I go to my range selection and I insert silence, that my markers don't move and the tempo doesn't move. So let me just do some more tempo changes here to make this a little more obvious. So I think what you might want to do is, let's say as I move this, if you go between two markers when you're in the range selection mode, this will do kind of a global edit. And you could also do this by holding down kind of a keyboard shortcut. Let me just move this back. Sorry. I think it's... Oh, sorry. Let me get the right keyboard modifiers. Okay, so if you hold down Control or Command plus Shift, so I could do that. And now I think if I go to my range, and this would globally select. So I go to my range and I say Insert Silence, that it will move not only the markers, but the tempo information. So make sure that you have kind of the range, and that's Control or Command plus Shift. So while you select, and then you could do kind of a global, and then go to your range, because otherwise you're just doing kind of one layer of events. So I do Insert Silence, everything will move over with the markers and tempo tracks. I think that's what you're kind of wanting to do. All right, let's go through a couple. Okay, it says I need to set up Cubase such that I can set tempo for a track by playing a specific key on a keyboard or MIDI controller. There's a couple different ways of doing that. One is if you want to set the tempo of a project, you could go to the project menu and there's a beat calculator. So here's a tap tempo function. So if you just kind of tap on the space bar of your computer keyboard, so once it's determined the tempo, you could automatically insert this at the tempo track start or at the selection start if you wanted to. If you record just MIDI information, also, let's say, so we'll just add a MIDI track. And let's say I'm here and let me just record. And I'm tapping along. At that point, I think we could go to under the MIDI menu, and it might be under functions. There's like a tap tempo or merge. Let me see if I could find. Okay, you can say merge tempo from tapping, and we can say our meter is in 1 bar. So, or let's say I wanted this to be every beat. At this point, I want it to be quarter note pulse, and then hit OK, and then it can make a tempo map based on what you've tapped in. Okay, so let's say okay, we'll go back to our feed. All right, thanks for all the great questions. All right, so just checking time. Okay, so just reading through comments. So hi there again. I have a question. Can I control my Cubase Pro with Cubasis in Android tablet? Need that for my brother who is a drummer. We have a dedicated controller. So Cubasis is its own DAW that can, function, very similar to Cubase in a lot of regards, but it's not a remote control. But there is an app called Cubase IC Pro that's available for iOS that you could use. So you could use Cubase IC Pro, and I think there's kind of a scaled down free version and a more extensive one. But check out the Cubase IC Pro, and that would be able to allow your, brother who's a drummer to have that work. Okay. Okay, just going through comments. Appreciate everyone's patience. Okay, my comments scrolled again, so just kind of. Okay, just reading through comments. Okay, so I see how can I mix two audio files into one track without cropping? So if you have two separate audio files, there's a couple of different ways. If you have, these files selected, let me just find another. And if we have multiple events selected, like here, you could just do, and you could do this for multi-mono or multi-files, but if you just do a render in place, you could say, let's render settings, and then at this point, you could choose to just, think there's an option for mixing down the files, but if you have multiple tracks selected, let me just see if I. Let me just see if I deselect that and just have the tracks selected. So here you could just say mix down to one audio file, and then you could just render and then have those two files merged together into, your one file like that. So you could use it doing kind of render in place as well. So we could do just for the selected events, so you could do that in a render in place. All right, so okay, so we have a question. Hey, Greg, can you cover quick tips, shortcuts for editing MIDI notes, things to speed up workflow like copying, editing? Some things become very tedious as a film composer, writing intricate things. So let's take a look at, some tips and tricks. Many film composers I know, one of the, features that they love most is, I'll just erase this part and we'll draw in, using some of the modifier keys can be really fast and easy. So if you double click here and let's say we have one long note and you wanted to, break that up, if we come, let's say, to the beginning of that pitch, and if I just hold down the scissors tool and let me turn snap on, and I could just say, okay, I just wanted to hold down the Alt key, then I could automatically split those notes. And if you wanted to just randomly, change the pitch, coming over here, let's say we got rid of that. If you wanted to duplicate, those events, you could do that just by hitting Command or Control D. If you wanted to, if you have a chord, I showed this one to Hans Zimmer, and he's like, "How could I not know that?" But if you wanted to edit the velocity on a chord, you could hold down, like just on one particular note where all these notes are starting at the same time. You could just hold down the Control and Shift, and that will allow you to edit the velocity of just one particular note, and you see the velocity curve there. If you have a lot of notes and you want to do quick velocity editing, so let's say I want to take these parts and we'll duplicate a couple times, and let's say I just wanted to see my velocity, but I wanted to retain that velocity curve, but not necessarily I wanted to, take my velocities and compress them. I wanted to tilt the velocities. You could do stuff like that. It's like I wanted that velocity curve, but I wanted it to, do a crescendo. So those are some things that can make a big difference. Many film composers love the fact that you could have, multiple articulation lanes. So if you wanted modulation, you click here. I wanted to see velocity. I wanted to see expression, and being able to work between those different events, being able to hold down, you can move notes just by selecting them with the arrow key, but I think if you hold down Shift, it could go up or down an octave. You could also select more notes, and if you wanted to hold down Control and left and right arrow, you can just move notes freely around as well. And that could work with like kind of our drum editor scenario that we saw a little earlier. So those are some, but there's lots of, and even in your controller editing, if you wanted to come here and bring that down, tilt it, or if you go to the edge, we could expand or compress those contents as well. So, and if you like, this information, I could select that information with the controllers and, move it and move the notes with the controller by default. So, all sorts of great stuff. So I hope those are some tips that can help you. Okay, whenever I change the sample rate on Cubase 10.5 or change project to open another, I have to reboot my Mac. Otherwise, no sound. Any idea? Thank you very much. Check, this could be sometimes Cubase, and depending on the audio interface, sometimes Cubase can change the sample rate of the interface, and the interface will follow, and sometimes it doesn't. So it depends on the interface itself. So if you're here, you may go to the VST audio system. And let me just see if it's in this, or if I come here, make sure that you have, you could check kind of the clock settings. My interface I'm using doesn't have an external clock, but you could make sure that Cubase, some interfaces, you could change the sample rate easily in Cubase, and Cubase will kind of control the sample rate to do it. Some are going to be kind of locked, and especially if you're locking to an external clock, you may want to, switch it on the clock and then have Cubase reflect to that, but not have Cubase change the clock, your master clock. So I think it's going to be kind of your clocking setups that you would see different options here for your clock source. That's where I would take a look, and I think you can get it figured out. But some interfaces don't allow you to switch sample rates. Like a Dante system, it's kind of, really a nuisance to switch from 48 to 44.1. And you kind of, tend to be like a Dante native system. Like Dante Virtual Sound Card is problematic. Okay, so I see why only Pro version have plugin on F7. So I'm not sure what F7 is. So, F7 is going to be okay, so the F7 is going to be our direct offline processing. So, that is, one of the features that's in Cubase Pro. I think you could still do, some processing. I haven't tried it in Artist. I don't use it a lot. But the direct off, but you may be able to just go to processes and be able to do, processing for normalizing in different aspects here for selected events. But, the plugins, I think that's unique to Pro. Just, as more of a professional feature with different feature sets. Okay, so question. Whenever I change the SMPTE rate on Cubase 10.5 or change a project to open another, I have to reboot my Mac. Okay, I think this is kind of the same, like continuation of the question that we just did. So, sorry about that. Okay, so let's move on. Thanks for all the great questions. I hope everyone's learned a couple tips and tricks. Okay, so... Okay, so let's see. When will Steinberg have a phone line email address for advanced technical support like any other DAW company does? I know that the support can vary depending on what country you live in. I know I'm based in the United States, and we have a team in Indianapolis that has phone numbers and email support. Some of the different countries have different support mechanisms. Some of them are going to be tied into Yamaha support, depending on who the distributor is. But I know in the US, if you go to the, Steinberg US support, just Google that, you'll come up with a phone number and email. So there is support, and, we do lots of cool Hangout stuff as well. Okay. Okay, so it says, "Hi, Greg. Thank you for the hangout today. It should be possible to send the stereo master channel signal to an extra phone's out. Can you show that workflow? Thank you for your time." Okay, so if we have in the Cubase Pro, we could go into your control room settings, and here we could have different headphone sources. So, and the control room is going to need to be activated in the control room, enabled. And you could right click to add like a Q mix. So let's say I want to have this be, additional phone, or we'll just call it headphone 2. Okay. And then what we could do is we could connect our Q mix to different outputs of our audio interface. So you're going to need an audio interface that has either multiple headphone outs or multiple outputs that could be routed to a headphone amplifier. So if you wanted to duplicate the signal, you could just simply go to your headphone Q mix. And here, if you want it to have its own independent mix where you can have different levels. So if you have the drummer and they want to hear the drums do more me headphone mix, they could have an independent mix. But you could also just set this to the main mix for this particular headphone. And if you have the main mix set up, that way it's going to mimic what you have set in the control room. So, or you could have an up to 4 independent Q mixes as well. So you could do it that way. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so it says, "Hey everybody, just getting my home studio room set up. I bought Cubase Artist, looking forward to doing some recording. It's been since the 90s. I did use that since I did that in Cakewalk Pro back then. All right, we're great you have your Cubase Artist and that you're able to kind of come to the hangout during our stay home era. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Is there a preset or macro that can change the way you resize the lower level? I don't think mine is really working right now. It only shrinks it a minimal amount. So I'm just seeing, let's see, is there a preset or macro that can change the way you resize the lower level? So am I assuming that this is here? that this level, I'm not sure. So let's see if that is kind of carried over with different workspaces. So I'll just come here, add a workspace, and I'll make it a project workspace, and we'll call it smaller lower zone. Okay. So we'll have that, and let's make one that's a obnoxiously big lower zone. And I'm not sure if I just want to make, I could be misunderstanding your question. So I will add a workspace here. Okay, and let's see if I toggle back and forth, and I think I could just hit so, so maybe if that's what you want to do is maybe set up like two different workspaces. Looks like maybe it's not working that way, but I'm not sure if that's what you want to do, but you could try that. Okay. Okay, so okay, so it says question regarding direct offline processing. How can you tell which clips processing has been applied to? I don't use DOP enough because I think I don't understand how best to use it. What the direct offline processing is really good for is, when you come here, you could say, every time I wanted to do a vocal, I wanted to run it through a de-esser. I wanted to run it through, some different functions. So we could access it by hitting the F7 key. So if I do processing on this particular file, let's say, okay, I will choose to, reverse. I wanted to take just a portion of the file, and I could choose to, increase gain. So, and I wanted to take, just the ending of the file here, and, let's say do a fade in at the end and a fade out at the beginning. Will just be odd that way. Okay, so, so you could tell, what, as soon as you have the direct offline processing open, you could see all of the edits that have been done to this file. And a lot of people tend to shy away from working this way if you've been doing digital audio editing for a long time, because this is kind of deemed a destructive edit. But with the offline processing, at any time I could save this project and open it up in 10 years and say, oh, the gain was stupid. Let me just right click and remove that one process without affecting anything else that was done. And you could also just say, I wanted the reverse to come after, and we could change the order of it. So it stores the original file at all times, and also allows you to reorder it. And unless you specifically choose to make all these permanent, you could go back, at any time and just choose to delete all, and you're right back to where you were. So if you have different, if you have a computer maybe that's not super fast, and you're like, hey, I just want to run everything through like a Magneto plugin to give it a little analog warmth, you could just select all the files and just drop in the Magneto plugin, all the files, and it's not taking any CPU, but it's just process those files. But if you want to change it, you can just by selecting the files and hitting F7, and you can see what processes have been done on that particular file. Okay, so you see a question, VST Connect still working? Yes, and there's an update that was just released last week, and it seems to be working really well for lots of people. Okay. Okay, so I see a question. Which automation mode allows just to make wee dips or spikes, after which the fader goes back to the previous level? How the automation kind of works is it's going to go back, and my son is knocking on the door. Let me just talk to him real quick. Hang on. All right. So it's going to, and if we think about how automation works, I know this could be a little counterintuitive, but if you think about how an automation physically works on a console, let's say if I'm automating this particular parameter, I could double click, we'll go to the inspector, and let's go to, let's say, our fader. We'll go ahead and just automate this particular parameter. That when we have this, that it will kind of, right now, let's say I'll just put it into touch mode, the default mode. So let's say I automate this fader here. Okay. And I bring that down, bring it up. So if we wanted to do that, you can't, and sometimes people wanted to, return to a level that's not there. So if you, just come here and let's say this is where my automation point is. If you write an automation point at the end, I could just let go of it. And then when I let go, it'll revert right back to where it was. So I know it's different than how other programs will work, but if you just want to do little bumps and stuff like that, it's quite easy. And within the automation panel, which you can access by hitting F6, there's different modes where you could just say right to end, and that will place an automation point to the very end of the value. And something else that was changed in version 10 is when they kind of revamped some of the automation or in 9.5, is you could just select with the range and just do a little bump just like that as well. So that kind of, and if you wanted to just have your object selection tool, you could just kind of bring that up or down by selecting the little diamond there. So that kind of alleviates a lot of it as well. Okay, let's move on. Thanks everyone for great questions. We'll be wrapping up pretty soon. My son's getting a little restless. We'll maybe go in our 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so we have a question. Hey, Greg, is it possible to play back different sample rates in one project? We could have one common unified sample rate, and that's kind of how the clocks will need to work to make sure all the audio files are playing back in time. You have multiple file formats and multiple file bit depths, but you want to have one unified sample rate. So the answer would be no to that. All right, let's go through some more questions. Okay, is there a way to insert MIDI notes without double clicking, without clicking the pencil tool? Is there a way I can just use the object tool to put MIDI notes in with only one click? I think it's going to be still reliant on having, your object, because your object selection tool is just that. But, and again, you could just, toggle back and forth between your different tools. So if you wanted to, just draw in MIDI notes, you could do that. And, so, I know some people want that, but, I think it makes sense to have a separate tool to enter data in versus selecting it because, so, but I could pass that along that I know some people want to write without having to switch tools, but it's really, just hitting, one, and, different, key commands here. So, so just hit 8 and you could just kind of go back and forth between the different tools very easily. And you could remap those tools if you wanted to. Okay, says, hi, Greg. If I'm recording an audio patch in a gap between two other samples, how can I have the pre-roll get up to speed and only punch in a recording in the gap itself? Does that make sense? Okay, so Any gap between two other samples. Okay, so I think what you could do is, let's say, I think if I'm reading this right, if you wanted to just have the punch in between like these two events. So if you used a range selection tool and then hit P, this way I'll hit I for punch in and O for punch out, and let's just arm the track. And now when we do that, it's going to punch in and punch out without affecting the files behind that were behind it or in front of it. So I think that's what you want to do. Just try using the range selection tool, hit the letter P, and that sets the left and right locators and could set the punch point. And then, just hit I and O, and you should be, I think that will work. Okay. Okay, so says, hi, Greg. Can you explain your take on triggering MIDI drums using audio hit points? For example, I have the audio for the kick drum, and I want to trigger a sample from Addictive Drums VST. Yeah, Cubase does a really great job with this. So we will come over here. Let me just jump to a different project. It's kind of set up for this. Okay, and I'll just revert this quickly. Okay, so in this project, I have some drums. And let's say if we don't really like the kick or snare, and I just wanted to replace that. And let's say I have an instance of Groove Agent loaded up here. And I'll just open the instrument. So let's say I have a kick on C1. So I will leave that track selected, and I will double click on my kick track. And then I will go to my hit points, and I'll just kind of turn these on. We'll go to a threshold, and I'll just kind of zoom in and make sure that we have primarily the kicks. And at this point, I'll just say create MIDI notes. And I wanted to retain a dynamic velocity. And I wanted to go to a C1, which would be probably the kick drum and Addictive Drums or Groove Agent. And I'll go to the first selected track where I had Groove Agent selected. And now I'm triggering. So it made a MIDI track. So that's really all you have to do is, just come over here and do the hit points. So as soon as you go to your hit point definition, and then just create MIDI notes, and you'll be replacing your drums in a matter of seconds. Okay, just kind of reading. So question, I just bought Cubase Pro. If you could go through project setup and studio setup windows, that would be helpful. Coming from Pro Tools. So, when we want to set up like our bit depth, the audio sample rate, this is where we could do kind of your project setup. So we will come directly here to go to your project setup, and here, you could set, sample rate, bit depth, record file format, your stereo pan law, your max volume type. You have her mode tuning if you want to get into that, your project length. Your studio setup would allow you to, if you go to the VST audio system, this is where you could have your input, where you could define your audio interface. If you go to the MIDI port setup, this is where you can see all of your available MIDI input and output ports as well that are defined in the system. So this way you could have access to most of the other things. If you wanted to set up, like we talked earlier about generic remote or setting up quick controls, you could do MIDI learning. so that you could have a controller with 8 MIDI knobs be able to control different functions. If you want to add different external controllers, click on the plus sign, and this would allow you to add like a Mackie controller or drive your Cubase from a Yamaha console or control surface. So, okay. Let's see some other questions. Hi, Greg. Is there an easy way to transfer automation lanes on a VST instrument track to another MIDI track? And why are these lanes not saved when I save the instrument as a preset? So the automation lanes are going to be in the project itself. So it's not necessarily going to be carried over. So if you have automation, let's say if I have automation here, I could copy that automation. So I could just copy. And if I go to this automation lane, I could paste the automation like that. Now, if you wanted to carry over, and that could work for MIDI information as well. If you wanted to have the automation of a MIDI track carried to another project, just go to your file menu to import and do tracks from project, and you could select a particular project here. So let's open this up, and you could choose to include or exclude automate. You could choose your particular track. So you say, I want this, and I wanted to include the automation, but not the events, or the events. So you could say, I want the automation, I want the channel and inspector settings, or the events and parts. So you could select which particular parameters you want to be included in your import from a different project. But generally, we could think of the automation as being tied to the project and not to the instrument, which can be used in multiple projects. And that's kind of why you see that difference. Okay, go through a couple more quick questions, and then I'm going to have to wrap up. I hope everyone's learned a couple tips and tricks. Thanks, everyone, for great questions. And if you want to send questions in advance, you can send it to clubcubase at steinberg.de. And if you want to put your email address in the body, it kind of gets forwarded to me so I don't get to see the email address where it comes from. So that'd be helpful. So let's take a look. We'll maybe do one more question. Say I used a synth to make a hi-hat, kick, and snare. I now have those 3 synths on 3 tracks. How can I drag the MIDI data onto a pad on Groove Agent, or do I have to make it an audio file first? So I think with Groove Agent, if you wanted to have, you could drag, let me just test this just to make sure. So I'll add a Groove Agent SE here. Okay. And I'll just load up a quick pattern with presets. Okay. Okay, so the patterns we can drag out. So let me just go to the pattern pad here, and I could drag the pattern to the project window, but let's see. And then you could just drag like the MIDI pattern directly to a pattern pad if you wanted to. So you could kind of make your own. So you could drag audio samples, and one of the cool things that you could do is, like, let's say if I have like multiple snare mics going on a particular instrument, if you have a beat agent kit, you could just drag audio onto a beat agent, and you could drag multiple files. But if you have like the pattern that you're working with, you could drag the patterns from Groove Agent directly to the Groove Agent track, and then drag MIDI information back to the Groove Agent patterns as well. So, okay, let's just okay, all right, and see if there's one last quick questions. Okay, just seeing a lot of comment on Groove Agent. Okay. Okay, so I think we've gone about 3 hours and 11 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. My son's been very patient. I appreciate everyone's patience. I know sometimes, he's, he just, needs attention during the day during our stay home period. So I appreciate everyone kind of bearing with me as I, got a TV show and a game set up for him. I appreciate everyone's questions. We're going to be doing these hangouts for during our stay home period. We're trying to do them on Tuesday and Friday at this time. If you have questions, please send them if you want in advance to clubcubase@steinberg.de. I know I didn't get through every question, but we try to get through all the questions as complete and succinctly as possible. I hope that everyone's learned a couple of tips and tricks. And we'll see you on the next hangout. Please, everyone, stay safe and healthy, and spend this time to learn how to make great music and record audio in Cubase. And we're going to see you on Friday starting at 1 p.m. US Eastern, so the same time. So please feel free to again give a thumbs up to the video, to leave a comment. And then we'll see you guys on Friday. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions, and have a great day. Goodbye.